But yeah, no, I'm more of a journalist, and to your point with UFOs, so with Sasquatch, we've sort of coined a phrase. We don't know what they are, so we don't know what they aren't. One of the things that's really been hopping, that's become very, very clear with our research over the last few years is um, that if you start doing Venn diagrams of the phenomena that is actually observed, you start noticing overlapping patterns that shouldn't be there unless there was a connection. And this started when I wrote my book, Metroplex Monsters, Dallas Demons, Fort Worth Goatmen, and Other Terrors of Trinity River. Available wherever fine books and trashy rags are sold. I actually happen to have a few in my backpack if y'all are interested. But like I said, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, some gas station somewhere probably has one. But I started noticing that there was a difference between what was said was seen and what people actually see, right? It started, I was, obviously it's Dallas, so you got to talk about the Lake Worth Goat Man, you got to get all those reports, and I actually was able to extend a lot of the information because there's a lot of stuff that everyone focuses on the Fort Worth. They don't realize that there were other accounts in Cedar Hill, and there's a history of these accounts going around. I was able to talk with the Cedar Hill, Historical Society. They had some excellent accounts they were able to record, and so I was able to sort of put some pieces together, along with lore that goes back to the 1800s, and stories that go back from the 1800s, that allows you to sort of track their migratory patterns in the area. But I was looking at the Lake Worth Monster, and I started noticing when I was doing the chapters in the Goatman, because there's several Goatman bridges all around the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I started noticing, I'm like, hold on, this is Jim Mars's account, right? And I realized what happened was the name Goatman became the nickname for Sasquatch in the area because it was such a big event. And so everyone starts to put that name on there. And the problem is, if one was sighted, anything paranormal became the Goatman, right? And so we started seeing, and so the thing is though, because the name was associated with what was seen in Fort Worth, I was like, hey, this is the same thing. But when you look at what people were actually saying, they were seeing, they're like, my name is Bob, and I had this encounter. You're like, hold on, that's not a Sasquatch. It's something else entirely. And so we've started over the years looking, and like, there seems to be a difference between what people say is seen and what people are actually encountering. And when you just get the names removed, you start seeing that there's a lot of overlapping phenomena with poltergeist activity, UFOs. Tom, you were talking about that over there. There does seem to be a lot of overlapping phenomena, so that's one of the things we're exploring. Tom, Mr. Bowden, please come over here and tell the people who you are. We're just doing introductions at the moment.
All right. Yes, I'm the Oregon State Director for Mufon, the Mutual UFO Network. And Mufon, the mission of Mufon is scientific research into UFOs for the benefit of humanity. And what that entails mostly is studying the reports that people submit to us. We rely on the public to tell us when they see something they think is a UFO because they don't know what it is. And then we follow up, analyze what they report, and if possible, we give them an explanation. We'll say, oh, it was a satellite, or it was an aircraft, or it was a bird, or whatever. But if we can't find an explanation that logically fits what they saw, then we call it a UFO, unidentified. And that's basically what Mufon does.
You two, you can get closer here. We don't smell. I mean, I don't. I mean, Mr. Davis does, but it's not that bad. Okay, just saying. I mean, I've only bitten like 3 people today. I've had most of my shots.
Can I add about
No.
both of them?
No.
Yes.
No.
I must.
Okay, fine.
Don't make me explode your head. I have an account, especially that when you were talking about in Texas, that really reminds me something that is very that you, I'm sure, have heard of, that is based here in the Pacific Northwest, and that is Bandage Man.
Okay, never heard of that.
Oh, really? Okay, so Bandage Man is, I've been tracking the legends of Bandage Man. Anyone been driving from Portland, Oregon to the Oregon coast, Seaside, Cannon Beach? area? Well, a few of you have, a few of you have not. I recommend you take the trip. It's actually a beautiful drive. And the way the legend runs, approaching urban legend status, is at a certain point, the highway from Portland crosses and merges with 101, the coast highway, and there's an overpass. And as the cars are making that exchange, and they enter kind of once past the overpass, there's some trees, and particularly people driving trucks, pickup trucks or large trucks, when they pass through there, this big huge critter dressed in bandages, bloody bandages, jumps in the back of the pickup truck and then pounds on the pickup truck, sometimes breaks the glass, in the rear window glass, and it stays there screaming and yelling until you're just about ready to get into Cannon Beach, and then it will jump off into the woods, leaving behind a telltale bloody bandage. Now, I actually read through some older accounts from the 1970s about Bandage Man, and even earlier, kind of anecdotal, and the way the interpretation was that Bandage Man was a lumberjack that was injured in tree felling. And in reality, that whole part of the Coast Range was part of the Tillamook Burn in the 1930s. Right, it's starting to sound familiar. So historically, the historic records are there. One person actually was severely injured and died. And so the interpretation I made and these other people made is that as they had him in the back of a pickup truck wrapped up in bandages trying to get him to the hospital, that he died somewhere along that route, which is pretty familiar sounding to people who are into the ghosts, the paranormal. Now, what has ended up happening is, as the years have gone by, collective historic memory does not remember the Tillamook Burn. And so I read where he is now transformed into various other very plausible beings and critters wrapped up in bandages, including when the movie Bubba Hotep came out, he became a mummy that was part of a traveling roadshow that went off the road, and the mummy now wanders around. And then he became a Bigfoot that was captured and escaped, and is still sort of hanging around that area. The latest being that is actually a Bigfoot alien hybrid waiting for the mothership to pick him up. All of these, as people write them, are meant to sound plausible, but the very genesis is something that is very tragic and very real, but it doesn't resemble what's happening today, or the belief today. Thank you for letting me share.
Oh, no. That's why we're here. We got time to kill. I have one question for Tom, but then I want y'all's questions. Unfortunately, I can't take the mic in front of that, so y'all will need to come up. But we want to hear y'all's questions, your comments. That's one of the reasons we're here. But Tom, I got a question for you. We were talking earlier about the overlapping phenomena, right? When you start looking at what people actually see, and actually you start noticing patterns, even if the thing looks different. We've got a lot of accounts of missing time, all the things you usually associate with a UFO abduction in scenario, but instead of it being gray aliens or the insectoids, it's a bird man dancing on a water tower with other giant birds, and then we have the same phenomenon. Or it's literally something that looks like a demon coming through a wall. My question is this: if we're seeing the same phenomena, like you get rid of the names and the things doing it, it's all the same phenomena, but we're seeing different, not just three, but almost a dozen different, very, very different looking creatures doing it. Is it possible that none of them are seeing the real and great Oz behind the curtain, that everything's an illusion? Is that a possibility?
Well, yes, it is a possibility. And one of the things that's maddening about all this kind of stuff is sometimes you just get overwhelmed with the possibilities. One of the things that I have learned to do over the years is I found that you don't have to have one right answer to all these mysterious questions. What you really need to learn to do is to keep keep a collection of ideas in your head that could be true, but you're still waiting for more understanding, more evidence. And the great Stanton Friedman, the late great Stanton Friedman, UFO lecturer, brilliant man, he called it his gray basket. So to him, if something was definitely true, it went in his white basket. If it was definitely false, it was in his black basket. But if he wasn't sure, it was in between, it was in the gray basket. And that was all the questions that were dancing around in his head that he didn't have a final answer to. And the kind of thing that you're talking about, one of the greatest books on this subject is called Passport to Magonia by Jacques Vallée. And if any one of you runs across that at Powell's Books or something, yeah, buy it, read it. He talks about the parallels between more modern UFO abduction stories and some of these strange folk tales from Europe and other places where they talk about people being grabbed by fairies and taken to some alternate reality. One man who supposedly was taken to live with these fairies for a year, and when he finally escaped and he made his way back to his village, he discovered that no one knew who he was. Like, more than 30 years had gone by. All the people he knew were dead, and there was a whole new population of people there, and they didn't know who he was. You know, those kind of stories. Now, that's sort of touches on what he's talking about. That doesn't give us an answer. That just gives us more, mysterious things to ponder.
No, exactly. I love that. Yeah, Jacques Vallée, I've quoted a lot in my books, just for that reason. Because it's the problem is oftentimes we get locked into one answer, right? And we treat that answer as if it's the fact, and it's like, no, we have to take the accounts. We have to start processing them and having honest conversations. Otherwise, we're not going to really come to anything. But we want to hear y'all's questions, your comments, because I know we have some brave people in the crowd. I can feel it.
There's no such thing as a stupid question, okay? There's just a question that should be asked that wasn't asked.
What's the name of that book again?
Passport to Magonia. Passport to Magonia by Jacques Vallée. It's an old one.
It's a good one, though.
What's the coolest thing you got at your museum?
I don't have a museum.
I thought he
That's Cliff Brockman, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I'm way better looking.
You're the Mufon guy.
Yeah. Mr. Davis, you...
Oh, no, I was just shifting, but I'll talk.
Oh, yeah, no, please. Do you have a museum?
Actually, I have a museum about a building.
There you go.
All right. To answer his question, which really doesn't paranormally relate, and by paranormal I don't mean just ghosts. Paranormal means something that's just outside of what people consider normal. 200 years ago, well, 250 years ago, lightning was paranormal.
Yeah, fair enough.
And now it's normal. But as far as me, I do military history, and actually I'm the head of a 501c3 that does military history in Vancouver, Washington. And so we have artifacts and we have photographs and we don't have a building.
Interesting.
So, but no, I was kind of talking some other things that are still about investigation. Most recently, I've been on a show called Alaskan Killer Bigfoot, and you and I very briefly chatted about that. And so here is also, I guess that's being the gray basket, in that there are some historic facts, and yet the conclusions are not there, because you can have a hypothesis. The scientific method really is you develop a hypothesis and you test it. You do not necessarily look for information that proves you're correct. You look for information that shows that your hypothesis was wrong, and then you tweak the hypothesis and you keep on retesting it. So in the case of Alaskan Killer Bigfoot, which is in Portlock, Alaska, the historic record shows that in the very early 1900s, on that particular site, that they established a cannery, a fish cannery, seasonal employees, but there were a couple of year-round people. And then over a period of decades, it grew to the point where they had 100 seasonal employees working in the fish cannery and on board the fishing ships. And around the time it started turning into a big operation, they started having off-duty employees who were up in the hills hunting disappear. Some of them, they never found the bodies. Some of them, they did find the bodies later, washed up in the lagoon. They figure after the rains washed the bodies down through the river channels to essentially the bay, the lagoon. So these are known historic facts. Known historic fact is that they virtually overnight abandoned the town in 1950. And although people have come back for very short stays or very short visits, nobody's rebuilt the cannery, nobody's built the village, and that's the premise for this show is the native people want to come back. They're expanding beyond their carrying capacity of their current town, and they want to move. So here we've got people, native folks, coming back and saying, is this safe? Because they attributed all of the death to what some people would call a Bigfoot, but this is not a cute, fuzzy, cuddly Bigfoot that wants to get out of your way. This is one that rips people to pieces. Yeah. So this is the premise work for this, and so in this show, I came as what I am, a historian, and there are historic records dating back to the 1700s, and archaeologically there are some interesting things going on. But they brought on people with different approaches to try and explain what's happening. So this is where all of the conclusions are the gray basket. Interesting. So I'm hoping for questions so that we can.
Yeah. Well, so funny story about the Portlock incident. So on our channel we have Jessica Jones. She's a remote viewer. She recently viewed those events, and yeah, her conclusion was that it was a Bigfoot, or actually a clan. That essentially they'd just gotten, like they had been sort of isolated for a long time. They just the humans coming just got too close, and they didn't like it. And so yeah. I mean, it's again, gray basket stuff, but it's interesting. Onto the question of the museum. I don't have a museum personally, but I have worked on I call it the Creation Museum in a Box. There's only 10 of them. We'll be selling them later at the Creation Evidence Museum, but we have some other materials. And there is it'll come with a replica of the London hammer, the iron pot found in coal, but it has write-ups on some of the more, some of the evidence that doesn't get a lot of attention because it's very damning to sort of the modern mainstream, like the Delk print, right? The Delk print is a theropod print and a human footprint has overlapped it, and they've done scans of it. And the thing is, you can actually see compression layers in the footprint. So it's like if it had been carved, you wouldn't have compression layers. But you can see the compression layers, meaning that both footprints were there when the rock formed. So essentially it shows that a theropod stepped and then a human being stepped into it. And there are other footprints just like it. And there, again, the London hammer is a hammer that doesn't rust because it's been bonded with chlorine, which is really weird if you took chemistry, because chlorine's highly reactive to iron. You can bond them, but you usually get a liquid or a powder out of it. It doesn't stay as a metallic form, and so it's very, very odd. I talked to a lot of metallurgists about it, and they're like, we don't know. It's like, yeah, you could use chlorine to create a tool that doesn't rust. They're like, well, we don't know how you would do that. The London hammer was found in the 30s in London, Texas, and it was encrusted in a matrix of the Kalechi rock and fossilized clams. And so, again, the write-up goes through all of the things, sort of arguing, partly against the people who claim, oh, it's just a modern hammer. It's like, well, it can't be a modern hammer. And yes, there is a museum of hammers in Alaska that I talked to on this. And I can't find anything that matches this hammer. And again, it's the chemical composition that really makes it bizarre.
On the Sasquatch stuff, 100 years ago up in, if you're familiar, around the Mount St. Helens area, in the 8 Caves region up there,
yes.
there was a story, written up in the Oregonian 100 years ago. Do you know of anything, about that or any other modern time activity up in that area?
Not off the top of my head. Most of my expertise is in Dallas, but I think Mr. Davis does.
Yeah.
Okay, one of the things, especially 8 Caves, as a tourist destination, it's a series of lava tubes. I did archaeology work at the Mount St. Helens Monument some years ago. Yeah. I also...
Maybe tell them about the story about 8 Caves.
I will in a second. But I also worked at the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest outside of Trout Lake, not Trout Lake, but basically out of Stevenson, which is a Bigfoot free zone. It's Mania County. So the story is that in the late 1800s there was a mini gold rush up there in the Cascade Mountains, and so there were some miners that were up there in a cabin in kind of a valley, and one of the miners saw a, for want of a better word, a Bigfoot, a tall, hairy critter, at some distance, and he shot at it. He didn't kill it, but he wounded it. There was a scream, and they repeatedly found blood. And so they kind of, at night, they retired back to their cabin, and that night, a whole tribe of them from the high hills looking down into this little mini valley, because they needed the water to sluice their gold ore. So they're right there at the bottom instead of being high up in the hill. And so they were rolling logs and they were rolling rocks down, and at a certain point they came down and started pounding and trying to break through the door of the cabin. So that's kind of the story behind that. But anecdotally too, there's some thought that the gold miners, if you want to take a more mundane view, there were some lumberjacks up there too, and the gold miners were kind of, for want of a better word, dumbasses to them, and that it may have been a prank. So that's one side to the other. But 8 Caves themselves, as a recreation site, the lava tubes around Mount St. Helens, they were opened by a Boy Scout troop called the Eights.
Really?
Yeah. And so, is 8 Cave because Bigfoot was living there, or is it 8 Caves because the Boy Scouts are the ones who kind of enlarged the opening and started the first tours? I don't have an answer to that, but it's something why we're here.
Yeah. Any current activity coming out of that area in the last 50 years or anything?
It's funny, when I was working for the Gifford-Pinchot, this is in the 1990s, there was a gentleman named Datus Perry, and he was very low-key. Bear in mind, the 1990s, not a lot of internet. And so one of the things that he did was he actually let our district unit know, I'm going to be going into this cave or that cave, and I'm taking some black powder and dynamite, and I'm going to enlarge them to make better Bigfoot habitat. And he actually had a cigar box full of very carefully wrapped scat. Again, he died he died around the late 1990s. I don't know what happened to all of his samples, but he recorded himself, yes, I have encountered Bigfoot, or he actually had woven mats he was putting in there, and he said that there were critters there, but all of the evidence kind of vanished with him. And there have been people on the edges. See, skookum, the word skookum doesn't mean Bigfoot, it means magical being, or powerful magical being. A leptilicum also is a form of very powerful magical being. So all big feet are skookums, but not all skookums are big feet. So skookum meadows, just go to any national forest in the Cascade Mountains, and there's at least one skookum meadows. And so there were some researchers that believed, this is around the year 2000, that they had the body print of a Bigfoot as it was laying on the edge of the marsh, and they had thrown apples further into the water. So they had the body print of it laying sideways in the mud to get the apples. That's one of the more memorable ones.
Oh yeah. At the last, on the main stage, I did ask the question about UFOs and Bigfoot, and I liked your answer. Can you repeat that for those who may not have seen it?
All right. Well, personally, I haven't found a lot of material in books that ties Bigfoot and UFOs together, but there are a few cases. But I think what he's getting at is this. If you or people you know are out looking for Bigfoot or camped out somewhere hoping to see Bigfoot, if you see UFOs, and I'm not talking about necessarily a big disc or triangle, but anything you think is unusual you can't explain, please report it to MUFON. We do not know about any cases unless someone reports it to us. That's how we work. We receive reports from the public, we analyze them, study them, decide whether we think they're really UFOs, and if we think they are UFOs, we categorize them as unknown, and they stay in our database as unknown unless new evidence comes up later that proves that they're not unknown. The other thing that I think I mentioned was that in the ultimate analysis, people that have studied Bigfoot for a long time have come to the conclusion that Bigfoot is not just a flesh and blood creature, that he has paranormal powers, that he's something from the transpersonal world, if you will. And transpersonal psychology is just it's a branch of psychology that is on the academic side, is a way of addressing the paranormal in an academic setting. And UFOs also have elements of the paranormal, because we get reports of people, if they have a close encounter with a UFO, they'll get messages downloaded into their head, they'll hear voices of someone trying to communicate to them, or they'll see an object appear in thin air or disappear in thin air, things like that. These are signs of the paranormal. I think you touched on this before when you're talking about the different beings that are seen. You talk about greys or reptilians or whatever. Well, a friend of mine who's really been studying transpersonal psychology a lot, he says that the intelligence behind UFOs often projects into our head a picture of what they're going to let us see. So it isn't necessarily that you're seeing exactly what's there. You're seeing a mental picture of what you're being told to think is there. So, this gets really deep into the weeds, but I'm going to tell you, if you want to get deeply into the UFO subject, or any of these subjects that dance around the paranormal, that's the way you have to think. You have to be able to be flexible enough to understand that here I'm dealing with an area of the unknown, that there's a lot of pitfalls, there's a lot of things I don't understand. So you don't want to get trapped into thinking you know exactly what something is when it may be different than what you think you're looking at.
No, actually, that's a great point. So let me agree with you on that last point. And to take that one step further, one of the theories that I have is I think a lot of the encounters, the abductions, I think that in many cases, not all, but in many cases the people aren't even leaving, they're not being abducted. The event itself, what they're remembering, is more metaphysical. And doesn't mean something's not physically happening to the body, but I think it's happening to them in the room. Something is coming into the room, but the memories that you said are being implanted, or you could call it almost a transcendental experience. But I do want to let me push back just a hair on the Bigfoot thing, and it's not a pushback in so much as maybe a little more detail, because one of the things we've been talking about on Texas Front Porch in exploring is, to Cliff Brockman's point, there's plenty of physical evidence for a naturally occurring creature that we can call Bigfoot just for the sake of the conversation. And I agree, with a lot of paranormal activity, you don't get the same kind of clearly physical evidence that we get with Bigfoot. Plus, so many of the stories are, I was driving down the road and it crossed the road. Like, that's the end of the story, right? But then you do have the things that are far more bizarre. Bigfoot's talking to me telepathically. I saw a Bigfoot here, I drive 80 miles, and it's now tapping on my tent. Or it's followed me home, and it's appearing in my house. One of the things I use the story all the time is, if you wake up in your bed and there's a 7-foot tall black shadowy figure with red glowing eyes, it's a shadow man or a demon. You wake up from your tent and you look outside, you say the exact same thing, it becomes a Bigfoot. So the question that we have is, what if there is the working model that we have is there's a physical Bigfoot, right? Something that does eat, sleeps, procreates, just kind of hangs out, does Bigfoot things, but then there is a separate paranormal skookum phenomena. And then the real question is it that we are projecting our thoughts that maybe, we're putting it into the Bigfoot box, or is this other paranormal phenomena hiding as Bigfoot? Does it want us to think it's Bigfoot some of these times so that we don't recognize it for what it really is, something that is not a naturally occurring physical creature? Which goes back to the question of, if we have, we start seeing all the overlapping phenomena, but we're seeing different things causing it. The question then becomes, is it actually the same thing? But everything that's being seen is an illusion of some kind. Because, like you said, some of these skookums are shapeshifters, right? We have so many people talk about, well, this thing's a shapeshifter. It's like, well, hold on. You got all these things that everyone claims are shapeshifters. What makes you think they're shifting into their real form? What if it's just the form that it wants you to think that it is, because that's what's convenient or advantageous to it at the moment?
Yeah. And if I could add to the mix, the theoretical mix, it's also it also has to do with the very nature of our ability to perceive time. Many people think time is linear, that it progresses at a set speed, a set rate, and that it's just a straight flow. And from physics, we know that's not quite correct, because the faster you're going and traveling, right, say in space, the slower time gets. But it's still in its own way straight. But what if time is fluid like a river? What if time flows, and just like gravity can change light and speed can change its rate of passage, that if there is a certain place, physical place, that has, by its own nature, is a little bit different, it can affect time, in that time may be flowing straight as a line, and then you go to, say, a location where historic events keep on happening. Yeah. And that area has some kind of energy from it, or natural minerals that affect the flow of time, so that time is now not flowing straight, but it's actually kind of curving around the area and eddies and goes into a backwater like a river. You were on this location in the year 2022, but what if, because time is flowing circular or back on itself, you are perceiving the year 1822 or the year 2222, but we're three-dimensional beings. The very nature of our eyesight, our brains, the electricity, the chemistry, we perceive three-dimensional worlds. How do we perceive that fourth dimension, which is time? Similar, by analogy, if you heard about flatlanders, these one-dimensional beings, right, that they can't see the third dimension. So what if what's happening is a fourth dimensional event? Yeah. So I throw that out there as part of the discussion.
No, that's a great comment. In fact, it was I wish I could take credit for this, because it's a great idea. Oh, do we have questions? You in the cowboy shirt. You're representing my hometown, so you get favorable picking at the moment.
That's great. And what I've observed is that this is so territorial. This whole.
Do you want to come up here so everyone can hear you? I figured if you're brave enough to rock the Dallas Cowboys, you're brave enough to
I guess so.
Steve back here, though, so
yeah. My name is Robin Roberts, and I have been involved just as a hobby and an interest in UFOs, ghosts, the paranormal, since I was in the 6th grade, and I won't tell you how many years ago that was. But as I've read and watched the internet explode with this information, and the similarities of all these different groups finding similar kinds of things, but I'm not finding a collegial, what's the right word, cooperation, to study together, to share papers, to share evidence. And I've been very impressed with, a number of the shows that are on now. There's a plethora of shows but probably the one that, and I don't know how many people have seen it, but the Skinwalker Ranch show. Now, the things that we're all talking about here, now, you know, the UFOs, the interdimensional travel, the time warping, all these weird anomalies, magnetic, they're finding so many, and many of these groups that are studying find magnetic abnormalities around the incidents, even to the point of, if you've watched Skinwalker, people getting radiation burns and so on. If you're familiar with the famous incident in England where the UFO actually landed, I can't think of the... But Bendlesham Forest, you know, you look at that, the people getting sick, these pilots that are now actually encountering UFOs like off the Nimitz and others, this has been going on for years. Now they're having different kinds of symptoms of radiation sickness. But again, there's all this is talked about in so many different ways and in so many different shows. But where's the synthesis? Where's the scientific cooperation to share that information to further the database? And it's so territorial. And I had a conversation, and I wish Cliff was here. I tried to talk to him just a little bit about this, and well, let's just say it didn't end very well. He didn't want to hear about it, and I'd really like to hear more from him if he was here, to maybe do a little mini debate about why and how the science world is approaching this. It's mainly first-person stories is what we're hearing so much of. You know, where's the evidence? You know, again, you hear that phrase, you know, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. We don't have that, but we have the opportunity with so many different groups of people instead of fighting for their little slice of the UFO pie. Why aren't they, you know, cooperating more? And another thing to think about is, you know, all of a sudden, you know, the government comes out. I don't know if you talked about this yet. And hey, guess what, guys? They're real. You know, we don't know what they are. That in itself, doesn't that just beg for, like, more consternation about what's going on? And we're hearing more and more now about, well, are they hostile, or are they good guys, or, you know, they could destroy our planet in 3 seconds, or and do whatever. So it seems like there's confusing and contradictory information going out. Is this part of the psy war, psyop? You know, I mean, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, am I? But, you know, it just, any common sense person, I think, would look at that and start asking a lot more questions of the government, of their congressmen, and so on. So I guess that's basically, you know, what I had to get out, because I've been thinking about that for a long time.
What I'm hearing is, we all need to get along. Like 3 people got that joke. But thank you for your setup on 2 points. And sir, in the hat, I love your hat. Come on up here, I want to hear your question. But like I said, it was almost a setup for my channel, the channel that I co-host on, Texas Front Porch. That is our entire point. We want a conversation with everyone. That's why we work with paranormal groups, we work with all kinds of groups. Tom?
I'd really like to address his question.
Oh,
okay?
about the...
Yeah. Here's the thing. When it comes to doing real science, real study, and analysis, getting groups together to cooperate, to understand the phenomena in general, it requires money.
Yeah.
Organization. Okay. Let me give you an example. MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, it is not supported by any government grants, university grants, big money from big donors. It's all supported by members. You know, people that are willing to pay $70, $80 a year to be a part of the MUFON organization as a member, and perhaps go on and become an investigator. We have a few people that have given more generously in the organization, but I'm not talking about millions of dollars. I'm talking about 1,000, 5,000 maybe given by these people. I mean, a lot of people involved in the organization give a great deal of their time. Personally, as Oregon State Director, I don't get paid for it. I spend a lot of time as a volunteer just working cases, organizing meetings, and things like that. Now, as far as what the government knows and what they're telling us, they know way more than they're telling us. I can guarantee you that. Let me give you one example. If any of you saw the hearings that were held recently, where they had a couple of high-level officers, they were generals, I think, talking, and a couple of other spokespeople for the DOD. When it got to the question of the possibility of missile silos being interfered with by UFOs, their answer was, I'm not read into that, so I can't address that. Well, I can tell you there's whole books on this subject. We have had intrusions on our nuclear missile silo bases on multiple occasions in multiple locations where UFOs hovered over the silo location. Like they say, there's a 10 missile flight in one area in Montana, North Dakota. They hover over that area, shut down the missiles. And the reason they shut them down is each missile has an onboard computer. And that computer, when the missile is ready to be fired, the computer is running. Now imagine if there was a need to launch those missiles, and you'd say, oh, wait a minute, I got to reboot the computer. You know, anyone know how long it takes to reboot your computer at home? You don't have that much time. Those computers are supposed to be running. Each missile has a separate computer. They're connected to the main system for monitoring, but they don't depend on the main system to work unless they're going to be launched. So what happens is when these UFOs hover over the missile silos, they inactivate the onboard computer and shut the missile down, so it's in no-go status, and that's happened a whole lot of times. But the government doesn't want to talk about that.
No, thank you. And we'll definitely talk about that again this afternoon on the main stage. So definitely be there for that. Howdy. How you doing? What's your name?
Ben.
Ben?
Ben Brown.
What's your sign?
Aries.
Good sign. Good sign. What's your question? And or comment or TED Talk.
What do you think about the idea that aliens are actually just hyper-evolved humans that develop time travel to come back and study their ancestors?
I'll hand this over to Tom first, since that is his bailiwick a little bit more. But then we'll go down the line.
Okay, so what we're really talking about is a known hypothesis, the time traveler hypothesis, and it has some viable aspects to it. You know, anytime you get into time travel, there's always some paradoxical questions arise, such as, how can someone from the future come back to our time and somehow impact current events in a way that changes the course of the future? How does that impact the existence of people in the future? I can't answer that. I'm just throwing it out there. You know, you've seen science fiction shows that are based on this idea, the so-called grandfather paradox. Okay, the reason that the extraterrestrial hypothesis is the most popular one is because it fits more of the information that we have discovered through the years. It isn't the only one, certainly. And one of the other questions that don't necessarily rule out the other two possibilities is, if these beings are here visiting us, where are they when we're not seeing them? Are they hiding on the far side of the moon? Or are they hiding under the ocean? Now, I like the ocean idea because there's a vast area under the oceans that's barely been explored. We actually know more about the surface of the moon and about the surface of Mars than we do about what's under our oceans. Yep. So they could easily have underground bases. And if someone thinks you can't create an underground base, You just got to read a little bit more about it. I'm a big fan of books, I'll tell you right now. There's books on this. Souders, what's his name, first name? Souders. Well, he wrote a whole book about underground bases. And the thing is, the military and our government have done this many times. They've created underground bases. Cheyenne Mountain, there's lots of them. So it's perfectly feasible even for our current technology to create underground bases. So I'm sure the aliens can do it too.
I want to come back to that question, but Mr. Davis has a great comment about science and all that.
You're the gentleman who disappeared.
Oh, the cowboy representative. He does.
Yeah.
Oh, is he fighting over there?
Oh, no,
No, the other guy.
yeah, the Dallas. Okay. He had commented about lack of cooperation, and I want to actually try and clarify. A lot of people would say Mufon is an amateur organization, and I wouldn't offend you by myself saying that. But see, some people would say these amateur organizations, they don't know science. They don't know science like doctors know science or like astronomers know science. And yet, I will tell you, there is rampant fraud and intellectual theft in the scientific community that goes on today because a lot of there's just this whole cultural paradigm in our society that I am exaggerating a little bit, but if somebody wears a lab coat that says Dr. Davis on it, you should trust them. Now, when I'm an archaeologist by training, and I would never say I'm a scientist because archaeologists use science, but we also use inference and analogy and our own experience, which you cannot quantify scientifically. But the first day I moved into my big archaeology job, which was there at the Wind River District on the Gifford Pinchot, my boss said, okay, just sit down, and he handed me a book and said, I want you to read this because you're fresh out of college and you think it wasn't, you think you know it all, but it's more along the way you have, in my opinion, too much trust in, quote, science. And this book was called Betrayers of the Truth. And this book came out in the late 80s. It was written by two doctors, research doctors, named Broad and Wade. Again, Betrayers of the Truth. It's been reissued and updated, but they just detail fraud historically. They start in recent history and a tremendous amount of research grants for cancer. There was one research professor that was doing experiments on anti-rejection drugs. I know you guys both probably heard that, where they took skin from black lab rats and grafted onto white lab rats and injected them to see whether or not they would reject the new tissue. And it turned out that this guy came in the middle of the night when nobody was there. He actually destroyed those original lab rats, and he brought a whole bunch of fresh ones in, and he was painting them with black felt pen with markers, and they caught him. But he'd been getting how many millions of dollars in grants for years. And when people are challenged, they go on the attack, and the scientific community all too often says, well, he's a scientist, we've got to trust him and his results, because he's got a lab coat that says Dr. Jones on it. So if you really want to read an easy-to-read book that details and is suggestive of develop a sense of skepticism, just because somebody's wearing that lab coat doesn't mean you should trust them. And the book's been reissued many times, but it goes back to ancient Greece, where astronomers are stealing each other's star charts. And so, anyway, that's something that I would recommend you read to just gain a little bit, and also know it's not just societies where nobody has the doctor in front of their name that do things a little bit less than what you would think.
COVID-19.
We have a lot of scientists who are members. We have a lot of scientists who are members of MUFON and very active in MUFON studies. We totally welcome them. They're the bread and butter of MUFON. I mean, we have a lot of other people that join MUFON just because they think, oh, UFOs are cool and they really like watching ancient aliens. Yeah, it's a big tent organization, but we have lots of scientists too.
You didn't take that. I hope that you didn't take that as a criticism of Mufon. I wanted to bring that out.
I just want to make it clear what MUFON's all about.
I'm sensing a fight. Come on, let's throw some Jello down. Let's.
We're trying to be nice to each
Yeah.
other.
Let's be nicely smack each other. No, so to your point, I think, I mean, again, literally over the last week, we've learned about, to your point, the SSRIs, the fraud in a lot of the Alzheimer's research. To your point, yeah, the problem is science is always political. And so there's always the official narrative, then there's the people then there's the amateurs doing the real work, and it's always the amateurs who change the game. Einstein was, quote unquote, an amateur. He wasn't official. He had all the training, but he wasn't considered official. It is always the person who's on the outside who changes the narrative. So I would argue being an amateur scientist is actually that's not a diss at all. That's a good sign. Yes, sir. Loved your work in Jurassic Park, by the way.
I just want to comment on the question of why there's so much territoriality in this field.
Mm-hmm.
My sense is that much of the interest is being driven by the different TV shows. Every TV producer has one interest, that's to get people to watch their show and not the others. Now, in reality, widespread interest, the rising tide lifts all boats. But their ratings depend on drawing viewers to them, not somebody else. So it's hard to get, I don't know who was it first said it, but it's hard to get a man to understand something when his salary is depending upon his value.
Yes, well, and that ties exactly to what Mr. Davis was talking about, and really what we've been talking about, which is honesty in the entire field. And to your point, how are we supposed to get people from MUFON, archaeologists, journalists, a biblical paranormal researcher like myself, how are we all supposed to get together if we're getting paid to go on one particular show and produce one particular narrative? And it is very destructive, which is why I recommend you see you visit and like, follow, and subscribe my YouTube channel, Texas Front Porch. Kidding. No, seriously, fun. But no, your point is very, very valid. It's like if your paycheck is coming from having this point of view, going back to the SSRIs, since it's a bit of a neutral territory here, it's like if your paycheck is, hey, this is the theory that this imbalance causes this, and so we can use these drugs to fix this, and you're getting millions or billions of dollars in grant money, your company's like, this is how we're going to make money. It's really hard to say, I'm seeing problems with our tests. It's like, well, maybe the problems aren't that big of a deal, because you want that paycheck to keep coming. You want to get another series, another season of. Yeah, exactly. You want to go out and you want to get that, and so you have that narrative. But I think to take it one step further, I do think, and this is something I find a little disturbing in any community, right, is that we all got into this one way or another, right? Usually due to an encounter, right, or something changed us that drew us into this. And for a lot of people, it's the answer that they're looking for, and sometimes the answer that we are the most comfortable with is the one that has to be true, because we don't want to consider another possibility, right? In a lot of cases, a lot of the arguments are almost religious in nature, where it's got to be this, and you listen to them, and I'm a religious person, I freely admit, I put that on the table, but I recognize religion when I see it. And so I think that's another thing, is we got to be able to say, look, we have to concern ourselves with the pursuit of truth first, not the thing not the pet answer or the pet theory that makes me feel good about what I've encountered. If you're not willing to, we all have to have the humility to say, A, I don't know anything, I don't know everything, and B, whether I'm comfortable with what the truth is or not, the truth is what the truth is. We have to look for that which is objective, and then I have to change my line of thought to meet with what I'm seeing. I've had to change my mind on a lot of things over the years, because when you look at the data, when you look at what people actually see, what people actually report, versus what, and you're like, well, hold on, here's all the phenomena, not just the stuff that's been curated to fit this narrative and the stuff that's been curated to fit this narrative. You start seeing patterns, and those patterns are often not something that makes people very, very comfortable. So to your point, though, you're right. As long as the money is, as long as there's money pursued down this path and this path and this path, it's going to be very, very difficult. But there is I would argue, the people you're seeing here, many of the people here, people on my channel, the people associated with my channel, we are more concerned with the facts and the truth than necessarily what our personal narratives are. I do think there is a growing group of people who are doing the research because they want to know what the truth is. And Mufon, I have a lot of respect for people who work for them and work with them because that is their pursuit. I've seen members of Mufon take accounts that I'm surprised that they would take, honestly, because it does go against certain narratives. So to your point, up until now, I think it's definitely a problem now. It has historically been a problem, but I do think there are people rising to make those changes that we would like to see. So we can actually start coming to some conclusions here, right? I mean, I'd like to go see a Jurassic Park with a Bigfoot in it, maybe an insectoid or more specifically a pterosaur. I want to see a pterosaur. Yes, ma'am. Would you like to come up?
No.
Okay.
I can be loud. I think a part of starting to work together is how about you two do a podcast or study together on the overlapping occurrences of biblically accurate angels, those are stone angels, and how in appearance they correlate to what we identify as the circular, spinning angels.
Yeah.
If you read the description of them, it's similar to sightings historically of certain UFOs. So, just saying, it's a starting point to working together.
Yeah, no, okay, so I'm actually doing an episode on Ezekiel's Wheel.
Yeah.
And so, great point, sir. You are welcome on the podcast anytime. In fact, hold on. Like, follow, and subscribe. I don't want you on my channel. Yes, you are. That's okay, I love shows. But so that's a great topic because when you get to something because when you talk about Ezekiel's Wheel, there's a lot of conversation there, and the thing is, there's also aspects of archaeology and cultural anthropology that you have to do to really understand that because, the whole biblically accurate angel thing, oftentimes, like I said, it's going to be an entire thing, and what you don't know is you've literally fallen into my bailiwick. The reason I'm not an archaeologist right now is because unfortunately I saw a little too much, and I realized, I'm not going to be able to do the work I really want to do. But I'm also an artist, so like the shirts that's me. So you're falling. That question is on the bailiwick. I will be doing a Siru papers specifically on it, and I will definitely have you on so we can have that conversation because it's a very complicated conversation. That you're right. I think there's absolutely a one-to-one with modern UFO and in past, angelic interventions, things like that. I completely agree with that. But specifically Ezekiel's Wheel really requires a broader understanding of the culture to understand what's happening because it really is it's fascinating, but it's a multi-hour conversation, and I don't want to bore all of you people here. I won't be bored. No, but you also have to see some things, right? Archaeologically speaking, to see what's happening. But your point is taken, sir. You have my official invite. We will make this happen. I'd love to have the conversation with you. Absolutely. And any other questions, comments? You again?
No, I'm sorry. You got to.
All right, fine.
Mufon's really interesting to me. Mount Adams. Is there any current activity reports coming from that area as far as orbs? And another thing is, you talked about what we're seeing over time. Are you getting more reports? It seems like I'm seeing or hearing about orbs, specifically in UFO reports. Is that kind of the common report you're getting nowadays? And
right.
Yeah.
Let me address Mount Adams. Okay. Remember I said I'm the Oregon State Director for Mufon. Mount Adams, last time I checked, is still in Washington. They have a separate organization there. They have their own investigators. I'd have to ask the State Director there that question.
Yeah.
But here's my take on the area, the Gilliland's Ranch there. People go up there to watch for UFOs.
That's the ESETI thing?
The ESETI Ranch, okay. Yeah. Now, what happens when you get a bunch of people out sitting watching the sky at night, they see things. Sometimes they see satellites, sometimes they see airplanes, sometimes they actually see UFOs. And there's no telling without really doing the whole due diligence to figure out what exactly did it look like, when was it. I mean, I use tools. I use a website called pardon me, Heavens Above, to see if there's satellites going over at a certain time and place. I use Flight Radar 24 to check for aircraft, but these are aircraft with transponders on them. I want to make that clear. The Flight Radar 24 does not track anything that doesn't have a transponder turned on the aircraft. So military aircraft often are operating without transponders. Some of the light, small aircraft, experimentals and stuff, they don't have transponders. And certainly not all radio-controlled so-called drones, or what the FAA now calls unmanned aerial systems, the little quadcopters and stuff. Unless they're commercial grade and really souped up, they're not going to have transponders either. So we use that kind of stuff to figure out what's being seen. Now, the next question, orbs. Yeah, we get a lot of orbs. We get photographs with orbs. We get people's sightings with orbs. I got to be perfectly honest. I really want to see sighting reports that show a structured craft. That means a triangle, a disc, even a sphere, a spherical, shiny sphere, cylinder, whatever. Something that looks like some kind of a craft. That's what I like to see. But that's my own preference. When it comes to the reports, we work all the reports that come into our inbox. And if it's an orb, so it's an orb. If you can explain it, if it's a dust mote floating in front of the camera, got caught in the flash, or if it's one of the very common things is people will take a photograph of the sky because they say, oh, what cool clouds today. They take a photograph and the sun's in the photograph. So here's the sun, and over here's a blue orb. Well, that blue orb is caused by the sun being in the picture. It's a phenomenon that occurs inside the camera elements. And I see them over and over again, and people like to argue with me, oh no, I'm sure it was really there. Yeah, but did you see it with your eyes? No. How did you see it? Well, it was on the camera screen, and it came out in the photo. Yeah, but you didn't see it with your own eyes. So it's a camera artifact.
How many credible reports do you think you get on an annual basis at Mufon in Oregon? Rough estimate. Hundreds, thousands, dozens?
All right, I need to define what you mean by credible. You mean ones that after we do our due diligence, we've eliminated the identified and the hokey ones like the people making up stories?
Yeah.
And the ones that we consider to be true unknowns, probably 40 or 50. Depends on the year, depends on the number of sightings in a particular year. Yeah.
Almost every week then. I mean, you get incredible ones. That's pretty
Well, just about. Well, I mean, in the last week I got 6 reports that were all the same thing. They were the Starlink deployment out over the ocean from the July 22nd launch from Vandenberg. Went around the Earth, came over and just off the coast. They deployed the 46 Starlinks, and they were still in a bunched line like this. And people said, one guy said it looked like a comet, another guy said, oh, a cigar-shaped craft, but they were all Starlink satellites, so they were identified. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yeah, Starlink has definitely been oh man. I can't tell you how many videos I've gotten from friends of mine who are like, did you see this video? I'm like, that's a rocket launch. It's like, well, why can you say that? Because it's high in the atmosphere. Okay. And I love the people I was talking to. I, on Tuesday, did an interview with people who are flat earthers. The episode debuts today. Actually should be running now. Again, I want to have the entire idea was calm, having a pleasant conversation. Like, I'm going to do a response video, but it was yeah, it's like some of the things they were talking about. I'm like, okay, but we know what that is. It's a rocket. It's like that's how it works. That's why it's arcing. So yeah, a friend was like, "Did you see that?" I'm like, it's a rocket launch. You sent me 3 of these yesterday.